April 15th was the 75th anniversary of the first time Jackie Robinson took the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, despite the barriers that Jackie Robinson broke as the first black player to play in Major League Baseball, Major League Baseball still has a race problem. Yes, only 7% of its players are black, and the history of black baseball players has been erased and in some cases whitewashed. The Baseball Hall of Fame is on a mission to change this. It has begun a 2-year project to create a permanent exhibit of Black baseball that tells the real history and contributions of Black players. The folks leading that charge join me coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
America's favorite pastime ain't all hot dogs and apple pie. And even though baseball is an integral part of America's history, it has struggled to deal with its history of racism. It wasn't until 2020 that Major League Baseball recognized the Negro Leagues as part of the major leagues. And the Baseball Hall of Fame has grappled with how to acknowledge the efforts by some of its inductees to uphold the color line. Plaques honoring racist players are still hanging in the Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame's decision to maintain these plaques is causing some to question its real commitment to addressing its past and the harms that these players inflicted. Joining me for my first panel are Ray Doswell, he's the vice president at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and Jon Shestakofsky. I've been practicing that name, Jon. He is the Vice President of National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. Good morning, Ray, and good morning, Jon. And Jon, you can pronounce your name again for me because I think I butchered it.
Well, it's not an easy one, so I'll give you a pass for sure. It's Shestakofsky, and it's all good. Thanks for having us. Thanks for having us on this conversation.
Shestakofsky. Okay, got that right. Thank you for correcting me on that, Jon. All right, Jon and Ray, Major League Baseball has a race problem, and it's trying to reckon with that race problem. I'll start with you, Ray. You're VP at the Negro Baseball Museum. So for folks that may not know what that is, give us a quick, kind of description of what that museum is.
Well, thanks for having us this morning. So the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is located in Kansas City, Missouri. We give the history of African Americans in baseball from the late 1800s through the 1960s, with emphasis on what was called the professional Negro Leagues at the time. And those leagues were developed by African Americans for African Americans, as well as Afro-Latino athletes. It was the highest level of professional baseball available to these athletes in the early part of the century, of the previous century, through to the 1960s. So 1920 to 1960. We also chronicle that history as it goes even back further to the 1800s, when African Americans began to pick up the early versions of baseball and ball and stick games and began to play it and perfect it in their own rights and try to create their own professional teams and leagues, but were denied opportunities to join what were the growing white professional leagues at the time. So this is a story of entrepreneurship. This is a story of pulling up your bootstraps, but also a way for African Americans to become, for lack of a better phrase, more American in many respects. So they created that, were very successful, had some of the greatest talent in sports history, and ultimately put themselves out of business because they were so talented, but also pushing the issue of integration both in the sport but in America as well.
And Jon, we know it wasn't until 2020, very recently, that Major League Baseball recognized the Negro League. Why did it take so long?
Well, baseball sometimes moves a little slowly, as we've all recognized over time. Major League Baseball does have its own authority as to how it recognizes statistics and history. I don't know that in their mind, this maybe was not as top of mind until some of the issues that came to the forefront in American society around that time. But other institutions and other baseball historians had long recognized the importance of the Negro Leagues. Here at the Hall of Fame, we've had exhibits about Black baseball for a number of years. And obviously it took some time, but Negro Leaguers celebrated in our plaque gallery alongside American Leagues and National League stars, and have been celebrating and recognizing the history of the Negro Leagues for a number of years. So Major League Baseball is certainly one institution, and an incredibly important institution when it comes to making this decision, but other institutions, Negro Leagues Museum, National Baseball Hall of Fame, and Society for American Baseball Research have long been pushing towards that path.
And I know that you don't speak, Raymond, for the Major League Baseball, but again, I'm still puzzled by this time frame. I heard what Jon said, but there have been lots of significant issues, periods in this country where we've talked about civil rights. We've had pushes for dismantling of structural racism. That didn't just happen with the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020. I mean, the civil rights movement of the 60s, far more significant than what happened in 2020. So why do you think, Raymond, that it took Major League Baseball so long?
First, we don't need to overstate this. The history of the Negro Leagues is an important history, but the issue is that Major League Baseball only recognizes the statistics of the Negro Leagues. They always recognize the Negro Leagues. Let's be clear about that. The issue is statistics, and frankly, statistics are fleeting when it comes to understanding the history of the Negro Leagues. But it is important to note that among the reasons why we don't have full day-to-day records of Black baseball teams in terms of when they played, who they played, although there's been a ton of work done by a lot of historians to gather as much information as possible, but that information is fleeting in part because of systemic racism. Negro Leagues teams weren't covered on the same daily basis as Major League Baseball teams. So the statistical records are frankly incomplete, but through a lot of hard work, there was enough material pulled together so that by historians and other institutions to say, here's enough information to prove that some of the Negro League teams and leagues qualify for what they felt were major league status compared to other major leagues that are out there. And that was the announcement that was made in December 2020. It's still a very nuanced and ongoing story.
But I think, didn't it go further than that? I actually have an uncle that played in the Negro League. He was contacted by, I guess it was Major League Baseball, but one of the entities, and was actually given a pretty huge sum of money as back pay.
Well, let me hold on, we got to clarify that as well. So that has nothing to do with the decision that was discussed in December. However, something that took place a few years prior, maybe even a decade prior, is that over time, Major League Baseball had also partnered in part with the Baseball Museum to develop a licensing program. And part of the licensing program was in a special licensing program for the Negro Leagues, working with entities like us because we have licensing to create logos, and those logos get sold to pay royalties for people to make t-shirts and caps and all kinds of things. And that helps fund the museum. MLB also got into that program to help create a program that would support players, and that money got dispersed at the time. And this is almost before I started working for the museum, among the 200 plus at the time living players around there. In addition, they made it possible for players, especially those in need, to get assistance from the baseball assistance team, or BAT as it's called, which helps players and umpires in need.
Well,
So
maybe, let me just say this, right? Maybe you and I are talking about two different things, because this didn't happen
Perhaps.
10 years ago, and my uncle isn't in need. So he was contacted and said, look, you were a Black player in the Negro League. Basically, you were treated poorly, and here we're going to give you hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I'll clarify the facts on that. But
Okay, very good.
years ago, and my uncle definitely wasn't in need. But I do want to ask you, Jon, about this exhibit, this new exhibit that's going to be at the Hall of Fame, and the decision. It was written in the Washington Post about the decision of the Hall of Fame to maintain the plaques of some of the white players that were instrumental in upholding the color line. Talk to us about that decision.
Yeah, so certainly there's a lot of thought and discussion that has gone into how we discuss and represent history in this country, in the world. What we try to remember here as the Hall of Fame is that we are a historical institution dedicated to the history of baseball. And that history is not always great. But what we also need to make clear is that the Hall of Fame itself is not just the plaques on the wall of the Hall of Fame's plaque gallery, where we talk about why certain individuals have been elected or were elected at the time that the election took place and were at that time celebrated in American history. We are also a museum that tells the story of baseball history through 3 floors of exhibit spaces, all the way from the 1800s to today's game, with exhibits dedicated to cultural issues like race in baseball, an exhibit about African-American baseball, about women's role in baseball history, about the Latino influences of baseball. And so we are able to tell a more complete story in our museum space. And that's what we're endeavoring to do. What we took on a couple of years ago was really starting to take a closer look at some of those individuals who have plaques in our plaque gallery. Obviously on those plaques, you only have about 80 words. You can't tell that entire nuanced history and very complicated history that needs to be told. But in our museum space, we have much more freedom to tell those stories in full and provide the proper context that can allow our visitors to understand better, not only why these individuals were celebrated at the time that they were elected to the Hall of Fame, but also why we need to recognize what they may have done to create, real massive problems in American society that led to or, furthered segregation in baseball. So there's certainly a lot that is discussed in the museum. And part of what we're taking on in this new exhibit is basically a complete look at how to best do things just as you're describing and tell a more complete story.
Was there any consideration, Jon, about removing some of those individuals who have this very sordid past of upholding segregation in baseball, or maybe putting them in their own gallery, or somehow acknowledging that this is not what this museum wants to be associated with today? Was there any consideration about that?
Yeah, our board spoke at length about a number of issues and ways to tackle this appropriately as, again, both a cultural institution and a historic institution. And ultimately, it was decided that the best course of action would be to tell the most complete story possible in the museum space and in the plaque gallery. To add something I didn't mention, but we actually added a sign. So everyone entering our plaque gallery understands that what's written on the plaque represents how that individual was celebrated at the time of their election and does not tell a complete story. We actually go out of our way to indicate that the information on the plaques is not a full story and that the museum is going to be able to tell that full story. So in our way, it's a way to continue to recognize the history of who was elected to the Hall of Fame for the reasons that they were elected, but also have the opportunity to tell that more complete story in the museum, where it's appropriate, and to be able to get into a lot more depth than you can in a plaque gallery.
And Raymond, Jackie Robinson obviously is, such a large figure, looms so large, not just in baseball, but in the history of African Americans, the history of this country. Help us understand how significant Jackie Robinson was in terms of integrating the major leagues.
So what a lot of people need to understand is that Robinson, to a degree, is not the beginning of the story. In many respects, he is the apex of the story, a story that begins several years before him, going back to the 1880s, when there were actually a handful of African Americans who did play in what would be considered major league teams. and the Hall of Fame chronicles those players, as well as Black players who had significant roles in baseball, like Bud Fowler, who's going to be honored as well this summer with Hall of Fame induction. So Robinson breaks a long drought of Black participation at the top levels of baseball when he appears. Yet at the same time, he is bringing in or ushering in the era of this multi-talented athlete who is abundant in the old Negro leagues. So he stands on a lot of, Robinson stands on a lot of shoulders in many respects as a pure athlete and baseball player, introduces the country to not necessarily a new style, but maybe a style that they hadn't seen before as a player and athlete. And then to keep in mind, I think he is one of the greatest athletes of all time, as well as his brother is one of the greatest athletes of all time, Mac Robinson. So for to have that athlete play baseball is significant, and the fact that he's a Black man. He is compared among his contemporaries to Ty Cobb, who is among those controversial players, white players, but arguably one of the greatest and most aggressive players in baseball history. At the time, that's who he was compared with, and Cobb plays 40 years before him. So he is significant both in terms of how he plays, how he changes the game, and when he ushers it in, many other Black athletes that follow him, some of them have similar styles of play. And it really is a watershed moment, not only culturally in America, but for the game itself.
John, in that Wash Post article that I read, one of the critiques was that the Hall of Fame, the physical location, is in a predominantly white town, that the staff is predominantly white. And the question is raised about how are you going to authentically tell the stories of these Black players when your team, I guess, that works at the Hall of Fame doesn't reflect the people that you're going to be telling the stories about.
Yeah, that is a major complication for us as an institution. Our location is not conducive, obviously, to an incredibly diverse audience here in Central New York. But we are, moving forward, we've recognized that as a major issue and something that we need to tackle in a number of different ways to be able to tell that authentic story that's so important to our new exhibit about Black baseball. So we've done a number of things moving, as we move towards our new exhibit. One is partnering with historical and cultural institutions that can help provide us some of that voice and some of that understanding that we may be lacking. So whether it's institutions like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and folks like Ray and his team, as well as Smithsonian institutions. In baseball, we're talking to not only Major League Baseball, but Major League Baseball Players Association, the Players Alliance, which is a group of current and former players working towards social justice related to race. And have a number of players, former players, current players who are interested and involved in being a part of our advisory committee, as well as a number of members of the Hall of Fame, all the way from Ken Griffey Jr. to Dave Winfield, Barry Larkin, individuals who've lived this experience and can help guide us in this process and make sure that we're telling the appropriate and authentic story. One other thing we're looking to do internally is to hire a curator who can speak specifically to this storyline and can, again, provide a more authentic voice as we're looking to tell this incredibly important story for baseball and American history to debut 2 years from now. So a number of different things we are aiming to do, as we do recognize we're not set up as an organization geographically to naturally be able to tell the most authentic story in this regard.
Yeah, and I just want to make a correction. I was referring to the New York Times article that did a whole piece on your exhibit, not Washington Post. So it's 2 years. So 2024 is when the exhibit will go live?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the exhibit, so we've long had an exhibit about African American baseball here at the museum for decades and decades. Our most recent version of that exhibit was debuted in 1997 in celebration of Jackie Robinson's 50th anniversary of breaking the color barrier. Obviously, we are well beyond that now, and Not only, as we've discussed, do folks understand baseball and the Negro Leagues and their place in history a little bit differently than they did then, but obviously the way we've talked about race, the way these conversations take place now has changed, and the framework through which we discuss all of these topics has changed. So it's an appropriate time for us to basically completely redo this exhibit. This is not an update. It's going to be a completely different experience that is more appropriate to the current cultural context. And that's really our role as a historical institution and as a museum. It's to stay relevant with the current way that we're talking about all of these different issues related to baseball and American history.
Great, fantastic. And Ray, just one last question for you. Is there anything about the Negro League that perhaps people don't know that should know as we're having this larger conversation about race and breaking racial barriers and dismantling structural racism? Is there a fact about the Negro League that you think we should all be aware of?
I think it's important for everyone to remember that Jackie Robinson's appearance and the push from players from the Negro Leagues to integrate baseball is almost a decade before other major events in the civil rights movement, including the Montgomery bus boycotts. So baseball, to some extent, can be seen as some of the major public testing ground for issues of integration. I mean, there were lots of political pressures on the Major League Baseball teams to do this as well. Plus, the ending of World War II, the opportunity came to use baseball as a way of testing the idea of integration. And it was these Negro League players who would be the first foot soldiers, if you will, in this fight to a degree, and had to take some of the initial slings and arrows of what would come. And it was a slow process to some degree. Some would say slow because it still took about a decade or more before every team had at least one Black or Afro-Latino player on their rosters. So the Jackie Robinsons, the Larry Dobies, the Minnie Minosos, the Dan Bankheads, maybe some players that you certainly have heard of with Robinson, but Bankheads and others that you may not have heard of are all part of this process. And it's something that everyone should learn about. It's a very important part of our American history. And there's these Negro League players who helped really pave the way for integration in America.
Do you worry? Thank you for sharing that, Raymond. That's definitely important to know. And a lot of people, I'm sure, don't know that baseball was way ahead of the civil rights movement. We talk so much about that. Do you worry, though, Raymond, in this moment that the advances that were made with respect to Black players in the major leagues, the numbers have dwindled over the last decade or so? I think I read a statistic that, at one point there were almost 20% of the players were Black, and now that's down to less than 10%, maybe around 7%. Does that concern you? I'm
one of those people who, I would love to see more Black players playing baseball as a baseball fan in general. And I would hope that young athletes would take an opportunity to try baseball. It's better on your body to some degree, and it's a great game. It's a great game for learning and for experiencing life. But I'm also one of those people who want to make sure that we're not putting impediments in the way of young people to try baseball, because baseball can still give opportunities for college scholarships and other things. So we don't have the pipeline of players going from scholastic baseball to collegiate baseball to minor league baseball to Major League Baseball. And that's how it was explained to me by officials from Major League Baseball. And they're very sensitive to this issue and want to respond to the issue. And there are lots of great young Black talent out there. And so the numbers are growing thanks to the efforts of Major League Baseball and the urban youth academies and reviving baseball in inner city programs. I know you talked to Bo Porter. I know he's deeply involved in a lot of these things. So the numbers are trending slightly upward, but it is a slow process. But I just want kids to have access to baseball, to learn from baseball. And if that translates into them becoming more doctors, lawyers, and teachers, that's all the better as well.
Right on for the more doctors, lawyers, and particularly the lawyers. So we're going to end on that note. Thanks so much, Raymond, for joining me. Thanks so much, Jon. I can't wait. 2 years, we'll get to see this incredible exhibit. Great work you're doing there, and just hope that you can tell those.
I have to interrupt. Who is your uncle?
Oh, I don't want to tell you his name because I'll tell you offline. I'll tell you offline because I'm not sure he
Okay,
wanted that to be known. So I got to get his permission to share that. So
fair
I'll
enough.
tell you offline. But thanks so much to both of you for joining me and keep up the good work. Go out there and find those Black kids. And you're right, Raymond. Let's figure out a way to get them involved with baseball because it is a pipeline to college scholarships. Again, thanks to both of you for joining me this morning. My next guest is Bo Porter. He played professional baseball for the Chicago Cubs, Texas Rangers, and Oakland A's. He's been a coach and manager for the major leagues. Currently, Bo is a sportscaster for Major League Baseball Network. He is also the author of The End Game and The Real Life Empowered. Also a friend. Welcome to the show, Bo. So good to sit down with you.
Areva, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being a part of your platform.
Well, I want to talk, Bo, we've been having this conversation earlier in the show about the Hall of Fame and its efforts to reckon with baseball's sordid past as it relates to race. So we know this new exhibit is going to be launched at the Hall of Fame that tries to really tell the history of Black baseball players in a way that hasn't been told by the Hall of Fame. What do you think about the new exhibit?
Well, one, first of all, I want to commend Major League Baseball for all of their efforts to acknowledge the Negro League. It's been a long time coming. We've always had the Negro League Museum, but now as you start to look at the emergence of Major League Baseball, stepping out front and center and acknowledging a lot of the Negro League players that have not received, their just due as it relates to the record books, as it relates to just their place in Major League Baseball. So to be a part of this movement, it does my heart really good. Just knowing the history of the game, and now America will be able to know the history of our great game.
So, Bo, you have a unique role in Major League Baseball. You've been a player for several teams in the league. You've also been a coach and you've been a manager. So talk a little about what your experiences as a Black player, coach, and manager have been in a league that is still predominantly white.
Well, during the time in which I was coming up, when you look at the percentage of Major League players, it was somewhere around 17-18% at the time where I arrived at the Major League level. And that percentage...
So you mean 17 to 18% Black players?
17-18% Black players.
Okay.
And over time, that percentage just continued to decline. And when you start to look at the reasons why, one of the things that happened, Major League Baseball itself used to be free. It used to be in all communities. And you fast forward and you looked up and now baseball had become a pay-to-play sport, in which when you start to think about people growing up in underprivileged, underserved communities or financially challenged households, it just became way too expensive for people to be able to afford the sport. When you start to look at the equipment and bats costing, $350, $400, a glove costing $250. You look at cleats costing $150. It was just not affordable. So Major League Baseball had to take a hard look at this decline and say, what can we do as the parent sport to make sure that our game is accessible and affordable for everybody? And you look at the efforts in which Major League Baseball have set out, whether it's the Breakthrough Series, whether it's the RBI program, and Frank Robson was front and center, rest in peace, Frank, for his initiative with starting the RBI program, which is reviving baseball in a city. And you look at the Hank Aaron Invitational, the Breakthrough Series. We have an ID tour that's now going around the country. All of these events are basically designed to actually get baseball back in the city.
How successful? Because you mentioned that decline, and I think the statistics that I saw both says that only about 7% of players today are African American. So how successful have these efforts that you just outlined been in terms of bringing more Black boys in particular, and we should be talking about girls too, but bringing Black players into the fold?
Yes, over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to start to see the fruits of those labors. And it was an initiative that was embarked by Major League Baseball And this stuff takes time. And what I mean by time, we basically went back to the grassroots because baseball is a skill development sport. So you couldn't start at 18, 19 years old. You had to go back to the grassroots and start to get kids into these programs when they're in the 5th grade, they're in the 6th grade, and start identifying these kids. And once you identify them, now it's getting them on the right trajectory. And that's where the former players like myself have come in, and we have basically partnered with Major League Baseball in these initiatives. All of these programs are coached by former Major League players, former Major League managers. We have Major League executives that come out and scout these kids. So, I mean, it's an all hands on deck approach. We may not see the fruits of the labor today, but there is a wave that is coming. And Tony Regans and Dale Matthews, who head up, the programming for Major League Baseball, they have done a tremendous job. And the Players Association is right there hand in hand. And former players are lending their skill sets and all of their knowledge to the game.
So I'm really encouraged to hear that Major League Baseball has made these efforts to outreach in underserved communities, African-American communities and other communities of color. But I got to ask you both, it took until 2020, literally just a year and a half ago, for Major League Baseball to acknowledge the Negro League players. Why did it take so long? And basically, why do we need George Floyd, the death, the murder, the uprising for this to happen?
Well, I think over time, people look at the hierarchy of any sport, and you ask yourself, how can we be better? And I commend Rob Manfred and all those that stood for making this right. And when you look at the Negro League and the great players that came out of the Negro League, Jackie Robinson obviously being the first, but there were so many others that were multi-talented and put up tremendous numbers and had tremendous records. So it's good that Major League Baseball looked at this situation and said, how can we make our overall game better? And in doing so, that's why you see what's happening today.
So going back to the Hall of Fame, they're going to do this new exhibit and really try to highlight some of those players from the Negro League. But they have made a decision, Bo, that some find pretty controversial. And that decision is to leave the plaques up of white players who, many of whom were racist, many of whom tried to uphold the color line. They've taken the position that rather than to remove those plaques from the Hall of Fame, they're going to give an explanation. They're going to add what they call context to those players. What do you think about that decision? Because a lot of people think, how serious is your commitment to reckoning with your racist past if you maintain the plaques and the images of these individuals who were front and center in maintaining the color line?
Yeah, I think things happen in time. And when you start to look at time and you go back in time and where the game is at, it's just like when you look at pre-Jackie Robinson. Obviously, there were no blacks in Major League Baseball at that time. But as you fast forward and the world has evolved and baseball has evolved, I think it's only righteous that you look back and you say to yourself, how can we rectify this? How can we unite the two leagues and pay homage to those players that actually did perform at an elite level at that time? So I think Major League Baseball has stepped up to the plate.
I guess what I'm asking you, do you think those plaques should remain? Those plaques of those known overt racist players?
Say that one more time.
The plaques of the white players who were against integration of the game, who were against black players being a part of the game, who were inducted into the Hall of Fame, their plaques, their images are going to remain up. Some think they should be taken down, maybe moved to a different place. And I'm asking you, what, as a player yourself, as a former coach and manager, do you think it's right? And do you think it sends the right message to maintain the images and plaques of those white players?
Well, I will take this position on that, Areva. I think whenever you're talking about a hierarchy of overtreatment in the decision-making process, I don't think, I have a position or anybody have a position to make a unified decision based on information that may have been gathered that you really don't have all the information. So the decision to keep those plaques up or to take those plaques down, I think it's a unified decision, just like that same unified decision that was made to include the players that have been left out during this time.
But if you're going to include those Black players and you want to send a message to the world that baseball understands its past, it's atoning for its past, and it wants to go forward in a different light, can those races exist side by side with those Black players who have been locked out of the league for decades?
Yes, and I think the point that Major League Baseball is making is the inclusion of the Negro League and making sure that it merged the success of both the Major League Baseball and the Negro League to be unified in that manner. I think going back to rectify the past, I don't think is the focal point. I think the focal point in rectifying the past is the acceptance and the acknowledgement of those great players.
Well, on a separate note, I want to talk about your core media group. I know that's important to you. We're looking at all the branding. You just announced your core 100 most influential Blacks. Proud to say I made that list for 2020. Proud to be a part of that group. What's next? I'll ask you what's next for core media, but also in terms of baseball. What can we expect to see in terms of baseball moving forward and its efforts to address some of the issues that have plagued it, particularly with respect to Black players?
Well, when we spoke about this earlier, I think that baseball, you're going to see an influx of Black talent coming into the game because of the efforts that have taken place with all of the programming that Major League Baseball has initiated over the course of the last few years. The Breakthrough Series, the Hank Aaron Invitational, the IB Tour, the RBI program, all of those programs will start to basically see a wave of Black talent entering Major League Baseball. As far as Core Magazine, and yes, you are one of the recipients for 2022. Congratulations again.
Thank you.
You have done a great job of using your platform and using your voice and being a voice for the voiceless. So the Core 100 for me was an opportunity to use my platform to highlight and promote Black excellence. It was an opportunity to control the narrative as it relates to Black people that are out doing great things. Some people know, some people don't know. We took it upon ourselves to try to find those hidden gems that are moving mountains and really giving people hope. And my definition of hope is helping other people excel. So there are so many Black people that are out doing great things. Black people have been so good for so long. And the Core 100 is representation of what Black excellence really represents.
Well, again, honored to be a part of such an illustrious list, honored to be able to partner with you as you try to spread that hope around the country, really. Again, this is Bo Porter. He's the author of 2 books, The End Game and The Real Life Empowered. Thanks, Bo, so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and helping us just kind of understand what's happening with Major League Baseball. Obviously, this is big. It's the 75th anniversary of Jackie Robinson, first taking the, suiting up as they call it. So we're going to be celebrating all year the accomplishments of Jackie Robinson and those who followed in his footsteps and made tremendous strides in terms of race relations. Many people don't know about Jackie Robinson outside of him as a baseball player and what a champion he was for civil rights in so many ways. So this year, we get to educate people about the layers and the complexities and the many things that Jackie Robinson achieved in his short lifetime.
Yes, and when you look at April 15th, and Ken Griffey Jr. was the player that actually went to the commissioner, Bud Selig, at the time, and asked for permission to wear number 42 on Jackie Robinson Day, and the commissioner at that time, said, what a nice gesture it would be if all players wore the number 42. So, it's become one of the greatest days in our sport. I think when you start to look at the impact that it's made on a national scale, and people look at Jackie Robinson, the player. He's a Hall of Fame player. You look at the numbers, it's undoubtedly, the impact that he had on the field. But, I've been on record of saying this. What people got to really realize is Jackie Robinson was able to perform despite all of the adversity that he had to deal with off the field. So imagine going to work each and every day and being someplace that you're not wanting. Imagine having to, work under, the scrutiny of every mistake is going to be magnified. So, we sit here and we commend Jackie Robinson. I say this all the time. I mean, to me, I celebrate Jackie Robinson Day every day as a Black man, just thanking him for the opportunity that he supported me and so many other people.
Wow, what a great way to end this interview. Thank you so much, Bo. And yes, we all pay tremendous tribute to Jackie Robinson. He opened the doors for so many of us. All of us can look to him and thank him for what he did. So again, thank you so much, Bo Porter. I'll have you back. Lots more to talk about. Thank you.
Yes.
My next guest is Dr. Leslie Heaphy. She is a professor of sports history at Kent State. She's also the author of the Negro Leagues, 1869 to 1960. Good morning and welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, I want to start by picking up on something Bo said. Bo said he can't imagine what it was like for those Black players to have to endure what they endured in their everyday lives and then to get out there and play baseball at the highest level. You have studied the Negro Leagues, you've studied the players, and one of the earlier guests, Raymond, asked me about my uncle, who I said played in the Negro League, and I didn't want to reveal his name because he has gotten a large amount of money from Major League Baseball, but I texted my brother, and my brother said I can reveal his name, but his name is Russell Mosley. But my uncle was one of those players who played in the Negro League, but help us understand what it was like for those players.
Sure. I mean, what a lot of people don't understand is the difficulty of realizing that no matter where you went, you were not welcome. And that meant you weren't welcome in places to stay. You weren't welcome in places to eat. You weren't welcome in places, even in some of the stadiums, in the locker rooms to use the showers. I mean, we have stories of the players traveling, right, and traveling in multiple cars or traveling in the few teams that had buses and literally having to wash their uniforms in a sink and hang them out the windows of the bus as they traveled in order to get from one place to another, being chased out of places where they weren't welcome. The accidents that sometimes occurred because you've got a person who's driving, who's played a game, and now you're driving through the night and no opportunity to think about stopping anywhere. And when you put some of those kinds of conditions together, it really takes the achievements of these ball players to another level to realize what they were able to do day in and day out when the rest of their life was so difficult and so challenging.
Yeah, I just watched a movie last night. It was a biopic of Mahalia Jackson set in the 50s, and vivid reminders of what performers and athletes had to go through. She literally would be playing at a concert venue. She'd be the headliner at a concert venue where Black and white people, or mostly white in this case, had paid hundreds of dollars to see her, what would be the equivalent of hundreds of dollars today. And she could not go into the concert venue through the front door. She had to go through the kitchen. There was no dressing room for her. She couldn't eat with the other people who had bought tickets to this venue. So, and literally reminded of those colored only signs that were, very prevalent in public institutions during this period. So these players, I imagine, had to endure very much what Mahalia Jackson, this great gospel singer, had to endure as she was entertaining the crowds, but yet she was so humiliated and dehumanized throughout the whole process. So you had to go up there and sing after you were just ushered through the kitchen to get in the venue.
Yeah. So to think that you can't even, as a ball player, you can't even go in the locker room in some places. You can't take a shower. You can't, and yet you're expected to go out and entertain and play this great at the highest level possible, which they did regularly. And because, as many of them will tell you, they loved the game so much that they were willing to endure all of these other things in order to be able to play this game that they loved, even when sometimes those who watched did not clearly love them back.
So the Hall of Fame is trying to now rectify some of these wrongs. And with this new exhibit, this 2-year process, They've got this advisory board. Dave Winfield and other prominent African-American former players are part of this advisory committee, but they have a problem. And Jon acknowledged it. Like, I'm a white guy, our staff is white, we're in this white community. We're not really the best people to tell these authentic stories. How hopeful are you that this exhibit is really going to do justice to these players?
Actually, I'm very hopeful in the sense that I think that they have taken an approach, and a very serious approach already, to thinking about these very questions and recognizing some of the difficulties in past stories and how to better tell these stories and to look to different audiences, starting with the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, starting with some of these players who certainly come later in the experience, but understand much and have a direct connection to the kinds of stories they want to tell. The expectation that they're going to be looking at a new curator to help with the exhibit, to looking to historians of all ilks who are going to be able to provide some of the background and to be able to provide the research, particularly research that's been done since the last exhibit was unveiled in 1997. And so that opportunity to really delve into the authentic stories and to use the voices of the players and their families and things of that sort, I think is what they're talking about. And so I'm very hopeful that this will be a much broader and much deeper story to tell this time around.
But what about those plaques? I don't know, and I don't know the right answer, but it's kind of,
sure.
I'm feeling like they're like the statues, right? The monuments that we've just spent several years, if not decades, trying to take down, those public monuments of those racist, Americans that we were told we should worship and revere, that they, should be in the public square. And we know there was an effort to remove a lot of those monuments, but the Hall of Fame is making the decision to not remove the plaques of these racist players that upheld the color line, that were adamantly against Black players being a part of the major leagues. They're saying we're going to leave them there. We're going to put another plaque up that gives you a little bit of history. I don't know how I feel about that. In fact, I guess I do know. I guess I don't like it.
I was going to say, I think I do know how you feel. Well, and I'm a historian, and so I look at things particularly from that perspective. And I recognize that the Baseball Hall of Fame, it's the Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. And even in the discussions of removing many of the monuments and things, some of them were left up. Many of them were removed to other places. So they were not destroyed, not gotten rid of, because one of the difficulties for us as human beings is we're people who need to see things in order to be reminded, in order to be able to have those opportunities to tell the stories, to fill in the history. And I think one of the dangers, and maybe part of the discussion, and I wasn't part of it, but would be to say, if you remove those plaques, then you remove some of the opportunities to educate people and to explain why those were there and why and what the bigger story of, well, this stat on this little plaque says this much, but here's the rest of the story. And here's something about American history that we need to know and acknowledge, and that is that there were horrible things that were happening, and these people did terrible things. And I think sometimes it's difficult to have those entrees to tell those stories if we take away these pieces.
Okay, I'm going to give you that. Let me say, I agree with you. But if we leave them in their places, this is a place where they're being revered. They're there because they achieved something that was considered great in their sport. And if we leave them there next to the other people who didn't act in the way that they acted, are we in some ways normalizing their conduct? I don't necessarily advocate for taking them out of the museum or taking their plaques down, but maybe they shouldn't be given the same prominence, the same platform as other people. Can we have a special section where all these people are and we tell their stories? Because my fear is if you leave them in place as they are, that it's maybe that message about how harmful, how hateful they were gets lost, because they're planted in between you know, what I'm just going to call, for lack of a better term, the nice guys, you know, the people that maybe did fight for integration. Why should they be given the same level of, you know, celebration?
Yeah, and it's a really great question, and I think a very complicated question, because I think that is the balance that you're trying to figure out. And I think potentially one answer to that is simply thinking about this notion, as I often tell my students, when we look back in history, we don't get to pick and choose which parts we want to talk about and which we don't. And so recognizing, in some ways, to me, it allows us once again to tell a story that shows us what American society used to recognize and used to revere. I would also say that when we look at the plaques, they're only about, the only things that are acknowledged, and in most cases on them, are their statistics. And so they're being recognized in part for that country, that one small aspect of who they are, and the opportunity to broaden the story beyond that and say, okay, so this man is here, whoever that person is, and we want to acknowledge certainly that they made a contribution on the ball field, but then we get the chance to then say, but here's the bigger piece of the story and the much more important piece. And the fact that we can have those conversations today,
yeah, and I'm all for
shows us how far we've come.
I question how the community, particularly the Black community, will see the commitment to tell the authentic stories if you don't reckon with the people who were the major instigators of the segregation that happened in Major League Baseball. So yeah, we want to have a nice exhibit. We want to integrate the Black players, but we're still going to give a lot of credit to these white guys who were adamantly opposed to Black players being a part of the league. And it is complicated. You and I are not going to solve it.
Right.
And obviously they spent hours
and
days and months with their advisory committee trying to come up with the solution, and they came up with one. But
maybe to your point, out of this discussion, there could be a new discussion because they're going to bring new voices to the table, and that's the kind of progress that we continue to see. And so that could, who knows where this what may come out of these discussions.
Yeah, they're obviously, as you said, very complex. And as a museum, you don't want to erase any part of that history. And I'm in total favor of that. Let's I want to call those guys out. I don't want to erase them. Mm-hmm. I want people to know who they were, but I just don't want them to be elevated on the same platform and the same way.
You know what's kind of fascinating though? A lot of people go purely initially to see those plaques and not necessarily to go to the museum part. And some people, and I've known friends who've only gone to just that one part and getting them in the door. And then they realize, oh, wait, there's this whole other story that I never knew anything about. And so the plaques are often what get people to go. Yeah. And then there's that.
So I'm in favor of the plaques, but I don't want them. They should be like in the timeout plaque room. Like, okay, you're going to keep your plaque, but your plaque is over there, like in the outhouse, So just, that's not a perfect solution, but it's one I hope they consider. But I do want to ask you, though, Professor, about the players other than Jackie Robinson. We hear so much about him, and he is obviously phenomenal, and by some accounts, one of the best athletes of all time, even not just in baseball. But who are some of the other Black baseball players whose names aren't household names that also we're going to see in this exhibit or we should know more about?
Well, and that's one of the beauties of what has happened with Major League Baseball's announcements and all of this is the opportunity to raise the profile. I mean, just this fall, for example, the two players who've been elected, one of them is Bud Fowler, a 19th century ball player, who was one of the greatest promoters of baseball, Black baseball in the 19th century, owned a number of teams, played, had a career that lasted from the 1870s into the early 1900s. And most people know nothing about him. And now suddenly they're going to have this opportunity. And we talk about Jackie Robinson, and what we acknowledge is not only that Jackie opened the door for all those that came after, but he stood on the shoulders of so many ball players. and yes, we hear about Jackie, and then we hear about Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige and Cool Papa Bell, but there's also Rube Foster and Oscar Charleston, and one of my favorites, Mule Suttles from the Newark Eagles, big home run hitter, Pete Hill, Frank Grant, and the list goes. These are the kinds of players and their stories that are even theirs are still just the tip of the iceberg. And what I think this exhibit is going to allow us to do is to tell the story of not just the Homestead Grays and the Kansas City Monarchs, but also the Dayton Marcos and the Cleveland Tigers and some of the teams that many of these Negro League teams played all over the country, right? Because the story of the Negro Leagues is the story of Black baseball, which encompasses barnstorming teams, and it encompasses small town America, where lots of these players played many of their games. And so we're going to get to hear stories about, Vic Harris, who is considered to be, he is the winningest manager in Negro League history. Mm-hmm. And I guarantee that outside of a probably very small group of people, nobody's ever heard his name before. You mentioned your uncle, his story. These are the people whose stories are going to get to be told through this exhibit.
So the question now is, Doctor, is this enough? So we're going to have this new exhibit. Yes, my uncle was Russell Mosley. He received a sizable amount of money as, I guess, recompense for how poorly he was paid and treated when he was a part of the Negro League. Is this enough? And what more should Major League Baseball be doing to atone?
Well, I think it's the tip of the iceberg, and it's a step in the right direction, as each of these steps are. There's always more that can be done. I think it's interesting how few major league teams, for example, and this is just my thought, actually have for any kind of Negro League celebrations and opportunities to both on the field and then within their stadiums themselves. The Detroit Tigers have a wonderful Negro Leagues weekend and had for a long time. Pittsburgh, some of the others, but they don't. And now with the new announcement from Major League Baseball, for example, the opportunity alongside, just as the World Series flags and pennants that you fly for the Major League. Well, what about the Negro League team from that city? The Cleveland Guardians, should now be flying the Cleveland Buckeye. I mean, I think these are opportunities to recognize and celebrate and bring attention to, and these are just small examples of things, but I think that each one of these steps is a step in the right direction to bringing alive this history that is so important, not just to baseball, but to American history as a whole.
Yeah, no, I think it's so incredibly important. And one of my first guests talked about how Jackie Robinson's, breaking of the color barrier in baseball actually predates some
Absolutely.
of the significant achievements by the civil rights movement. So significant that we learn this history. And I know you've written this incredible book called you are the author of the book called The Negro Leagues. And you look at the Negro Leagues from 1869 to 1960. What is one fact in that book that you want everyone to know? If they read the book and don't remember anything else, what is the one fact they should remember?
Wow, that's I guess the one fact is just how incredibly inspiring these stories are, the incredible challenges and triumphs that come out, and in so many cases, I've always been inspired by and amazed at how just incredible these ball players were that we know nothing about, and the incredible obstacles they had to overcome, and they did, and still came out as these incredible human beings and ball players. And I would also say a second one. A lot of people don't remember the women who also have participated in Black baseball. And so I think that that's also another, and there's way more than people have any idea. Effa Manley, yes, she's in the Hall of Fame, and that is a beautiful thing, but she is very much the tip of the iceberg.
Well, that is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and I'll have to have you back so we can talk about the women in the Negro League, because you're
I'd love
right.
to.
That is definitely not something that is talked about. And just last question, how many people would come out to see these games? Are these like little tiny groups of people, or, do they attract thousands of people?
So it varied depending on where you were and the nature of the game. But you could, in a small town, you might get, the 500 to 1,000. But in bigger cities like Chicago and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, you can get 10, 15, 20,000 coming out. And then, of course, the most fascinating on this is the East-West All-Star Game, which was held at Comiskey Park. Most of the years that the East-West All-Star Game was held, the the Negro League All-Star Game had a higher attendance than Major League Baseball's All-Star Game.
So it was definitely considered a good sporting event by folks.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, support the leagues.
You go to Kansas City and it was the idea that people went to church and then everybody went to the game, and they had parades and they had all kinds of things to celebrate this wonderful opportunity. And so, yeah, this was not a small.
But I am so intrigued by this. I have one more question. I have to ask you this. So if you're in Kansas City, they had the white Major League Baseball would be happening like in a baseball field, some big field, right? And then the black players, where would they be?
Well, in some cases, so in Kansas City, for example, Muhlenbach Field was where the Monarchs played, but it's also where the Kansas City A's played. The Negro League teams in some big cities, that was one of the issues with Major League Baseball. They did rent out a lot of their ballparks to the Negro League teams. And of course, integration poses a challenge to that because you're going to lose that.
So Major League Baseball was very much aware that here's this whole separate league of black players who are playing. So we may play Monday night, and then that same stadium would be used by the black team on Tuesday night.
Absolutely.
And so the white people would go to the white game and black people would go to the black game?
No, it'd be a combination of both, white and black, to both games. And in some cities, a lot of places, the seating was segregated, just like everything else. But you would find a mixed group of fans.
Wow. And these black players obviously were playing at the highest level, comparable to what you could see at the Major League Baseball games.
Absolutely.
Wow. So fascinating. It's kind of hard to wrap your brain around that we lived in a society that was so segregated that literally here's a white team playing on Monday and here's a black team playing on Tuesday.
It's crazy to think about.
They can never mix. It's mind-boggling. Oh, thank you so much, Professor Heaphy. Again, the book is Negro Leagues, 1869 to 1960. Pick it up, read it, learn something about the Negro Leagues. I want to have you back to talk about those women who are part of it.
I would love to.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you again. All right. What a fascinating show. My goodness. I'm not a big baseball fan, even though I grew up in St. Louis. And if you grew up in St. Louis, you had to love the Cardinals. My grandmother did. So she listened to the Cardinals all day, every day they were playing. She listened on the radio, and I would, have to listen, and we'd have to go to Cardinal games. It was one of the big treats. So I guess in some ways I did like baseball. But this history of the Negro League and the segregation, just so incredibly, I don't know, just mind-boggling that we lived in a society not that long ago where literally if you were black, had to go through the kitchen, you had to go through the back door, you had to, be at your best, yet be so humiliated and dehumanized. All I can say is thank God for progress, and my words to live by. It is not perfection by any stretch of the imagination, but we have seen some progress. And obviously by the stories that were told this morning and the shrinking numbers of blacks that are playing in Major League Baseball today means we have so much more work to do. But it is progress. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.